The morning was bright and beautiful, the kind of day people dream of for a perfect wedding. The venue sparkled with flowers, white ribbons, and golden decorations that caught the sunlight just right. Guests began arriving in expensive cars, stepping out in fine clothes, laughter echoing through the air as photographers snapped pictures near the entrance. The bride's family stood proudly by the gate, welcoming everyone with wide smiles and polite greetings. Everything seemed flawless, until a modest car pulled up at the edge of the red carpet. From it stepped Daniel, the groom, helping his elderly grandfather, Mr. Harris, who moved slowly, leaning on his cane. The old man's suit, though clean, was old and slightly faded, its edges frayed from years of wear. His shoes were polished but worn down, and his calm, humble presence stood in quiet contrast to the luxury around him. The guests glanced at him with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Some of the bride's relatives whispered behind their hands, wondering why the groom's family hadn't arranged better clothes for such an important event. "He doesn't look like he belongs here," one cousin murmured, her eyes following the old man's every step. But Daniel ignored the whispers, staying close to his grandfather as they walked toward the hall. His grip was steady, his expression filled with quiet respect. For him, this wasn't just another guest. This was the man who had raised him, taught him kindness, and stood by him when no one else did. As they reached the main entrance, Mr. Harris paused for a moment, his eyes taking in the grand chandeliers and elegant decor. He smiled softly and said, "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" Daniel nodded, touched by his grandfather's simplicity. The old man didn't care for luxury. He cared for moments, for people, for meaning. Inside, the music played and the celebration continued, but a subtle tension hung in the air. The bride's mother greeted Daniel with warmth but offered only a brief, polite nod to Mr. Harris before turning away to talk to other guests. The elderly man noticed, though he said nothing. He had lived long enough to recognize when people looked at him with pity or pride. He simply found a quiet corner and sat down, resting his hands on his cane, his gentle smile never fading. Around him, laughter and chatter filled the room, yet his calm presence seemed to tell another story, one of grace, patience, and quiet strength. Daniel glanced at him often, feeling both love and guilt, knowing his grandfather deserved more respect than the people around were willing to give. But little did anyone know, beneath that old suit and weathered face was a story that would soon turn the entire wedding upside down. What looked like a simple guest sitting alone in the corner was, in truth, the man whose presence would change everything before the night was over. Inside the dazzling wedding hall, the atmosphere shimmered with joy, music, and laughter. The golden lights reflected off crystal chandeliers, filling the room with a warm glow that made everything look perfect, at least on the surface. Guests chatted cheerfully, glasses clinked, and the bride's relatives gathered in small groups, admiring the decor they had spent months planning. But amid the beauty and celebration, small whispers began to spread like an invisible thread. It started with one aunt leaning closer to another, her voice low but sharp. "Did you see the groom's grandfather?" she said, eyes darting toward the quiet corner where Mr. Harris sat. "He's wearing such an old suit. Couldn't Daniel buy him something new for the wedding?" Another cousin smirked, adding, "He looks so out of place. This is a grand event, not a street gathering." Their laughter was soft but cutting, echoing louder in the silence of those who pretended not to hear. Daniel, standing nearby, caught fragments of their words. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he thought about saying something, but he stopped himself. It was his wedding day, and he didn't want to create a scene. So he smiled politely, pretending not to notice, though inside, a quiet anger burned. Across the room, Mr. Harris sat on a cushioned chair near a window, away from the noise. He wasn't unaware of the stares or the whispers. His eyes, gentle and wise, had seen such looks many times before, the kind that judged without knowing. He looked around the hall, admiring the elegant flowers and the happiness in Daniel's eyes, choosing to focus on what truly mattered. His wrinkled hands rested calmly on his cane, and a faint smile played on his lips. But behind that smile was a deep ache, the sting of quiet humiliation. He had survived wars, poverty, and years of hard labor. Yet, being silently looked down upon by those who measured worth and appearance, that pain still found a way to reach him. A young waiter passed by and offered him a drink. Mr. Harris thanked him kindly, his voice soft, yet dignified, as if he carried an invisible crown of humility. Nearby, Daniel's best friend, noticing the situation, whispered to him, "Ignore them, man. People will always talk." Daniel nodded, but his heart was heavy. He looked at his grandfather, the man who once sold his tools to pay for Daniel's education, and thought, if only they knew who he really is. The irony was sharp. The very people mocking the old man had no idea that Mr. Harris's wisdom and inventions had once changed many lives. But for now, he sat quietly, choosing grace over anger. The music played louder, and laughter filled the air again. But beneath the surface, a quiet storm was forming, one that would soon remind everyone in that hall that true worth is never measured by clothes, wealth, or appearances, but by the strength of one's character. As the ceremony moved into the photo session, the hall buzzed with excitement. The photographer arranged guests in neat rows, calling out cheerfully, "Let's get everyone together for the family pictures." The bride's side gathered first, mothers adjusting saris, uncles fixing ties, and cousins posing with perfect smiles. Then came the moment for both families to join. Daniel held his grandfather's arm, gently guiding him forward. But before they could take their places, the bride's mother hesitated. She forced a smile, her voice polite, yet firm, as she said, "Maybe Mr. Harris should rest for a while. He looks a bit tired." Her words floated through the air like a soft insult, disguised as concern. Daniel's expression hardened. "He's family," he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. "He belongs in every picture." The room fell silent for a moment, and no one dared argue further. Reluctantly, the photographer motioned Mr. Harris to step in. The old man moved slowly but gracefully, leaning on his cane, his wrinkled face calm beneath the bright camera lights. Daniel stood proudly beside him, his hand resting on his grandfather's shoulder. But as they adjusted for the next shot, one of the cousins, trying to be funny, whispered something about how Mr. Harris's hands trembled while holding his cane. A few guests nearby chuckled softly, covering their mouths as if to hide their amusement. The laughter spread like a quiet ripple, sharp and cruel. Daniel froze, fury flashing in his eyes, but before he could speak, Mr. Harris turned toward the cousin with a gentle smile. "It's all right, son," he said kindly, his voice calm and full of warmth. "I've lived long enough to laugh with those who don't yet understand." The words, though soft, carried a power that filled the room. The laughter stopped instantly. Even the photographer paused, his camera halfway raised. The old man's tone wasn't bitter, it was forgiving, almost loving, as if he saw through their immaturity with the patience of someone who had seen far too much of life to be hurt by small things. The cousin who had mocked him looked away in shame, his face red. For a long second, no one spoke. Only the faint hum of music filled the silence. Then Mr. Harris chuckled lightly and said, "Now, let's take this picture before my knees give up." The tension melted, and a few guests smiled awkwardly. The camera clicked, capturing the moment, not just of family unity, but of quiet dignity, standing tall against judgment. As the group dispersed, Daniel felt a wave of pride and sorrow all at once. His grandfather had handled the insult with more grace than anyone else could have. But deep down, Daniel promised himself that soon everyone in that hall would know exactly who Mr. Harris truly was, and that the man they had mocked was far greater than they could ever imagine. As the evening reception began, The grand ballroom shimmered with golden lights and soft music. Waiters moved gracefully between the tables, serving sparkling drinks and trays of food, while laughter echoed through the crowd. The time came for speeches and gifts, a moment that everyone looked forward to. The bride's family took the lead, presenting their gifts with pride. Each box was wrapped in silver paper, each item more luxurious than the last gold jewelry. A brand new car key, and envelopes filled with checks. Applause followed every presentation, and compliments flowed easily through the air. Then it was time for the groom's side. Daniel stood beside his grandfather, smiling proudly. But when Mr. Harris slowly rose from his chair, leaning on his cane, the room grew quiet in curiosity. The old man walked to the stage, his every step steady but deliberate. In his trembling hands, he held a small, weathered wooden box, plain, unpolished, and clearly old. The murmurs began instantly. "What could that be?" someone whispered. "He couldn't even buy wrapping paper," another guest murmured with a smirk. The bride's father exchanged a glance with her mother, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Harris reached Daniel and his bride, his kind eyes warm as always, and said softly, "This is my gift for both of you." He extended the box toward Daniel, who immediately took it with both hands, bowing his head slightly out of respect. "Thank you, Grandpa," he said sincerely. A few people at nearby tables chuckled quietly, assuming the gift to be meaningless. Even the bride looked uncertain for a moment, though she tried to hide it. The old man noticed every reaction but said nothing. He simply placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder and whispered, "Open it later, when you both have a quiet moment." His voice carried both mystery and emotion. Daniel nodded, sensing there was something deeper behind the simple wooden box. As Mr. Harris returned to his seat, the room filled with polite applause, the kind given out of courtesy, not genuine warmth. The master of ceremonies quickly moved on, trying to regain the celebratory energy. Yet Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the box resting in his hands. It felt heavier than it looked, as though it carried more than just an object, perhaps a memory or a message. He turned it over gently, noticing faint carvings on the sides, initials burned into the wood, faded with time. The bride leaned in, whispering, "Do you think it's something old from his past?" Daniel smiled slightly. "Maybe. Grandpa never gives anything without meaning." Across the room, Mr. Harris sat quietly, watching the couple with a thoughtful gaze, unaware that inside that simple box lay something that would soon change the way everyone in that hall saw him and remind them that true worth is never measured by appearances, but by the heart behind a gift. As the night wore on and laughter filled the hall, Daniel and his new wife finally found a quiet corner away from the music and chatter. The dance floor glowed with lights, but their attention was fixed on the small wooden box resting on their table. Curiosity tugged at them both. "Should we open it now?" the bride whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. Daniel nodded, his heart beating a little faster. Slowly, he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled carefully beneath a layer of soft cloth, lay 3 items: an old black and white photograph, a folded letter yellowed with age, and a small, rusted key. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The photograph showed a much younger Mr. Harris standing in front of a brick building, his hands covered in grease, a smile of quiet pride on his face. Behind him was a faded sign that read Harris Manufacturing and Co. The bride frowned softly. "He had a factory?" she asked. Daniel's eyes widened as he gently unfolded the letter, recognizing his grandfather's handwriting. The words were written neatly, but with emotion that seemed to spill from every line. It began, "To my dear grandson and his beloved wife, if you are reading this, it means you are beginning your journey together, just as I once did long ago, with nothing but faith and hard work." The letter went on to tell a story no one at that wedding had ever heard. Mr. Harris had started as a factory worker, laboring long hours with little pay. Over the years, through persistence and sacrifice. He saved enough to buy a small workshop, slowly building it into a manufacturing business. But instead of seeking fame or recognition, he chose to remain humble, investing quietly in others. Daniel's eyes moved over the words in disbelief. "This company, the one that hosted your wedding today," the letter continued, "was once mine. When I retired, I handed it over to those who shared my values, honesty, kindness, and hard work. And with what remained, I built something else, a foundation, one that funds education for children who dream big but cannot afford to chase those dreams." The letter ended with a simple line: "The key you hold opens the office of the foundation. It now belongs to you both, to continue what was started long ago." Daniel looked up, his heart pounding. The room around them blurred as the weight of what they had discovered sank in. The bride covered her mouth in shock, her eyes filling with tears. All evening, her family had judged the old man's worn-out suit, his quiet nature, his modest gift, yet he was the very man who had helped countless lives without ever asking for praise. Daniel held the key tightly, realizing that his grandfather's true wealth had never been in money or property, but in the kindness and humility that defined him. At that moment, they both knew the man they had nearly overlooked was the true pillar of their family legacy. When Daniel and his new wife returned to the hall, their faces pale but glowing with emotion, they carried the small wooden box with them. The music softened, and curious eyes followed their every step. The bride's father, noticing their expressions, asked with a frown, "What's wrong? Did something happen?" Daniel shook his head slowly, his voice trembling. "Something happened? Yes, but not what you think." He gently set the box on the nearest table and pulled out the photograph and letter. "This," he said, holding them up for everyone to see, "was given to us by my grandfather, the man many of you thought didn't belong here tonight." The crowd fell silent. Laughter and whispers died instantly. The bride's relatives looked at one another in confusion, unsure of what he meant. Then Daniel began to read aloud parts of the letter. Mr. Harris's words about hard work, humility, and the years he spent building his business from scratch. The tone of the room shifted as realization dawned. The bride's father took a hesitant step forward, eyes wide. "Are you saying he was the founder of the Harris Company?" he asked, disbelief heavy in his voice. Daniel nodded, emotion thick in his throat. "Yes, the very same company that owns this venue, the company that made this wedding possible. He built it with his hands." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The same people who had whispered cruelly about Mr. Harris's old suit and unsteady walk were now staring at him in awe. The bride's mother, who had earlier tried to exclude him from photos, covered her mouth in shame. Mr. Harris sat quietly in his chair, watching the scene unfold. His eyes glimmered, not with pride, but with peace, as if he had expected this moment, yet needed no applause. The bride's father finally approached him, his voice trembling. "Sir, we didn't know. Please forgive us." Mr. Harris gave a small, kind smile. "You don't owe me an apology," he said softly. "You just needed to see that worth isn't always dressed in gold." The simplicity of his words struck everyone deeper than any speech could. Around them, guests exchanged guilty glances, realizing how easily they had judged him based on appearances. Some remembered how they had laughed when he gave his modest gift, unaware that it held a lifetime of sacrifice and love. Daniel stood beside his grandfather, proud and protective, his respect for the old man deeper than ever. The bride, too, felt tears well up. She had married into a family built not on wealth, but on strength of character. The night that began with luxury and pride had turned into one of humility and revelation. The whispers that once carried mockery now spread admiration. Mr. Harris, the quiet man in the worn-out suit, had reminded everyone in that room of a lesson they would never forget, that true greatness doesn't shout. It simply endures, waiting for the world to see it when the time is right. The hall, once filled with whispers and prideful laughter, now stood silent, heavy with emotion. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the old man who had silently endured their judgment just hours ago. The bride's mother, who had earlier dismissed him with polite coldness, felt her heart ache with guilt. Slowly, she walked toward Mr. Harris, her steps hesitant but sincere. The crowd watched as she knelt slightly beside his chair, her voice trembling. "I owe you an apology," she said softly. "We looked at you and only saw your clothes, not the heart behind them. I'm so sorry for how we treated you." For a brief moment, Mr. Harris said nothing. His weathered hands rested on his cane as he gazed at her with gentle eyes that carried decades of understanding. Then, he smiled, the kind of smile that forgave without needing words. "It's never too late to see people for who they truly are," he said quietly. "We all forget sometimes that value doesn't come from how we look, but from what we give." His tone was calm, not bitter. It carried warmth, and somehow, it made the apology feel complete. The bride's mother began to cry. Not out of shame alone, but from relief, as if his forgiveness had lifted something heavy from her heart. The bride, standing beside Daniel, felt tears streaming down her own face. She looked at her husband's grandfather, realizing that the man she had once underestimated now stood as the most honorable person in the entire room. Daniel stepped forward, his hand resting gently on Mr. Harris's shoulder. "Grandfather," he said, his voice breaking with emotion, "I always knew you were special, but tonight, you reminded us all what real strength means." The old man chuckled softly. "Strength," he replied, "is just kindness that never gave up." The audience clapped softly, some dabbing their eyes, others nodding in respect. The bride's father approached next, his pride replaced with humility. He extended his hand, saying, "Sir, thank you for showing us that true class comes from the heart, not from wealth." Mr. Harris shook his hand warmly. "We're all still learning," he said with a wink, "even at my age." Laughter spread gently through the crowd, not mocking this time, but full of admiration. The tension that once filled the room dissolved completely, replaced by unity and warmth. The bride and groom guided Mr. Harris to the dance floor, holding his hands as the band began to play a slow tune. The guests rose to their feet, applauding not for luxury or perfection, but for a lesson in humanity. Cameras flashed, not to capture beauty, but to honor grace. That evening, the old man who had arrived unnoticed and disrespected became the heart of the celebration, a living reminder that one act of humility could heal even the deepest divides. And in the glow of the lights, with tears and smiles mixing all around, everyone knew this wedding would be remembered not for its grandeur, but for the forgiveness that made it truly beautiful. The wedding night slowly came to an end, and the last of the guests began to leave. The laughter and music faded into a gentle hum as Daniel guided his grandfather toward the car waiting outside. The air was cool, filled with the faint scent of roses from the decorations. Mr. Harris moved carefully, leaning on his cane, but his eyes still sparkled with quiet peace. Daniel walked beside him, his heart full of gratitude and admiration. When they reached the car, Daniel helped him sit down gently, then paused, his voice soft and filled with emotion. "Grandfather," he said, "you taught us something today that I'll never forget." The old man looked at him with a small, knowing smile. "All I did was show up as myself," he replied, chuckling. "The rest was for hearts to see." His words carried the simplicity of truth, one that Daniel would carry for the rest of his life. In that moment, under the soft glow of the wedding lights, it was clear that the day had become much more than a ceremony. It had turned into a lesson about dignity, kindness, and the real meaning of worth. Weeks later, the story of what happened at the wedding began to spread through the town. People talked about the humble grandfather, who had once been quietly dismissed, and how he turned judgment into inspiration. The bride's family, once proud and distant, had changed. They visited Mr. Harris's small foundation, the same one they had ignored before, and offered to help. Together, they began funding new programs for underprivileged children, scholarships, food drives, and learning centers. Each time they saw the old man, he greeted them with the same gentle warmth, never reminding them of their past mistakes. He didn't need to. His actions had already rewritten the memory of that night. The bride, now happily settled into married life, often shared the story with others, saying, "I married my husband, but I also gained the greatest teacher I never expected." Daniel and his grandfather grew even closer, often taking long walks together through the park, talking about life and the importance of staying humble, no matter how high one rises. Over time, their story reached newspapers and community groups, inspiring people to look beyond appearances and respect every soul they met. Many who heard it said it changed the way they treated strangers, and even their own families. Mr. Harris never sought recognition or praise. He continued to live quietly, helping others in small, unseen ways. But to those who knew his story, he became a symbol of true strength, the kind that comes not from power or wealth, but from grace and understanding. As years passed, people still remembered that wedding not for its expensive setting or fancy decorations, but for the night when a humble old man taught everyone that true greatness wears no labels. It was a reminder that respect, once given freely, can transform even the coldest hearts, and that sometimes the simplest souls carry the most powerful lessons.